A humble woman is barred from entering a luxury restaurant until a millionaire invites her to the main table. The room glittered with crystal chandeliers reflecting golden light, and each table seemed an altar of status and power. Silk dresses, impeccable suits, and sharp laughter cut through the air like invisible blades. Then, silence fell as she entered. A young woman in a simple dress, worn shoes, and a look that tried to hide her embarrassment. The maitre d' intercepted her steps with a cold gesture, as if sweeping dirt from the red carpet. "This place is not for you, miss," he said in a tone loud enough for half the room to hear. Muffled giggles spread, eyes raised in judgment, cell phones raised discreetly to record the moment. She froze, her face burning with shame, while the world around her seemed to revel in her pain. Every second was a punch in the gut, every look a cruel reminder that she didn't belong there. It was then that a man rose from the main table, located right in the center of the room. Italian suit, gold cufflinks, aura of unshakable power. The silence grew even deeper as he walked toward the young woman. Many expected an order to remove her with even more brutality, but instead he extended his hand. "The main table is incomplete without you," he said firmly, his deep voice echoing throughout the restaurant. The maitre d' swallowed hard, the laughter died, and shock ran through every incredulous look in the room. She, stunned, didn't know if it was a cruel joke or a genuine gesture, but as he led her to the center of power, each step beside him became a silent blow against those who had humiliated her seconds before. The contempt turned into an uncomfortable silence. That night would not be forgotten. If this scene has already made you feel the shame, injustice, and unexpected twists that life can bring, don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel now to follow each new story that touches your heart and exposes the power of destiny. Leave a like to further strengthen this space where we reveal that no one stays on the ground forever. And write in the comments, do you believe that justice comes at the right time, even when everyone seems against you? Your answer may inspire others who are also living their own silent battles. The dining room exuded luxury in every detail. The polished marble reflected the yellowish lights of the crystal chandeliers, and the waiters glided between the tables like silent dancers, carrying champagne flutes and plates redolent of expensive perfumes. The restaurant, in the heart of Manhattan, was known for welcoming only the elite, tycoons, politicians, artists, and socialites who paraded their practiced smiles and calculated glances. It was a space that not only served food, but also reinforced invisible hierarchies. There, those with power flaunted it, and those without would never dare approach. Until that night, someone dared. The revolving door opened, and a young woman entered. Unlike the others, her dress was too simple for the setting, a cheap fabric that betrayed her origins. Her worn shoes contrasted with the glitter of the surrounding jewelry. Her hair, tied up in a practical way, revealed more the urgency of survival than the vanity of those who could afford time and luxury. She walked with uncertain steps, as if trying simultaneously to be invisible and resist the crushing weight of the gazes that immediately rose to judge her. Whispers began, discreet at first, but quickly transformed into waves of sarcasm. A group of well-dressed women laughed loudly, shamelessly, while a man in the corner raised his cell phone, disguising a photo that captured that uncomfortable contrast. The maitre d', a tall man with a rigid posture, stepped into her path. His polite smile, practiced for elite service, faded into a cold expression. "You must be mistaken. This place is not for everyone." His tone was heavy with condescension, as if explaining something too obvious to a child. A blush rose to her face, but she didn't back down. Her eyes swept the room, absorbing the contempt that dripped from every glance. Inside, her heart hammered in her chest, each beat screaming the reminder of the distance between her world and that gilded hall. The atmosphere grew heavier, as if everyone was awaiting the outcome of this intrusion. Some laughed, others just watched with cruel pleasure. It was a silent arena, and she was the spectacle. Her childhood was always marked by absence, and that absence smelled of rust and dust. She grew up in a small wooden house in a forgotten rural town, where the wind crept through the cracks in the walls, and the cold seemed to mock the thin blankets. Her father, tired of a life that offered him nothing but debt and disappointment, left early, leaving behind only silence and an unfillable void. Her mother, a woman with calloused hands and a distant gaze, struggled with 3 different jobs. But there were still nights when dinner consisted of only stale bread and water. From an early age, the girl learned to adapt to the stares that measured her worth by her worn-out clothes and worn-out shoes. At school, she became adept at cowering in corners, pretending not to hear the laughter when she opened the simple lunchbox that separated her from her classmates, packed with sandwiches and imported fruit. But there was something inside her that wouldn't be extinguished, a silent strength that kept her upright even when shame seemed to crush her. At 15, she lost her mother in a trivial accident, the kind that seems cruel because it happens without warning. She went to live with an aunt who accepted her more out of obligation than affection. There, every gesture was demanded, every plate of food accompanied by reminders that she was nothing more than a burden. She worked early, cleaning houses, caring for the elderly, doing odd jobs that earned her just enough to survive. Still, she harbored within her a burning desire to see beyond that narrow horizon, to prove that her life would not forever be a reflection of poverty. When she moved to New York, she brought little in her suitcase, a few clothes, a notebook full of notes, and the conviction that somehow she would find her place. But in the city that never sleeps, she discovered that loneliness could be even higher than the skyscrapers. She passed lit storefronts displaying a world that seemed made for everyone but her. She worked as a waitress, a saleswoman, even handing out flyers on the icy winter streets. And with each job I heard, in one way or another, that I didn't belong. Yet, there was something in her eyes, a firmness that no one could erase. Behind the silence lay stories of survival that would never be understood by those who merely inherited their privileged positions. On that particular night, the city was in a celebratory mood. One of New York's most talked-about tycoons had booked the entire top floor of the restaurant to celebrate the closing of a billion-dollar deal. Guests wore formal attire, and every detail seemed carefully orchestrated to display wealth. French champagne flowing constantly, hand-picked background music, waiters trained to serve as if they were part of a spectacle. In the center of the room, a group of young heirs laughed loudly, occupying a table with more bottles than people. They weren't there just to celebrate, but to display power. And like all mismanaged power, it needed a target. It was then that one of them, with the bored air of someone who had seen it all, issued a challenge. We bet no one would have the courage to bring a random stranger to this restaurant and make her sit here with us. Laughter followed immediately, accompanied by knowing glances. Someone added, "But not just any stranger. It has to be someone who would never, under any circumstances, belong here." The comment sent a trail of poisonous excitement through the group. For them, humiliating someone in public was nothing more than expensive entertainment, almost a sport. And it was precisely at that moment, as if fate had heard, that the revolving door revealed her entrance. Simple, out of place, clearly out of place in the glittering setting. Their eyes met immediately, and the provocation became an opportunity. The maître d', already trained to filter who belonged and who didn't, wasted no time in barring her, and it was in that cold gesture that the boys realized the perfect opportunity to turn the scene into a spectacle. Some took out their cell phones, eager to record every second of the embarrassment that was about to unfold. They didn't know who she was, nor where she came from, nor did it matter. To them, she was just a disposable piece in the cruel theater they had created. But amidst the muffled laughter and the looks of contempt, one man watched silently. He didn't laugh, he didn't comment. His eyes were fixed on her, as if searching for something beyond the surface. Unlike the others, he seemed to recognize something deeper in that embarrassment. Still, he remained still, waiting for the next move. And the next move would be the twist no one expected. The maître d' had already extended his arm, blocking her path with the firmness of someone who felt like the guardian of a forbidden temple. The words, "This place is not for everyone," were still echoing through the room when a sudden silence cut through the laughter. The millionaire rose from the head table. His imposing figure was evident not only because of his height or his perfectly tailored suit, but also because of the way every glance seemed to obey his simple movement. While everyone waited for him to confirm his humiliation, he walked toward her with firm steps, making the air in the restaurant tense with anticipation. She, stunned, didn't know whether to retreat or hold his gaze. But when their eyes met, there was something there that was neither mockery nor pity. It was a silent curiosity, almost recognition. The maitre d', embarrassed, tried to intervene. "Sir, I can resolve this situation." But the millionaire's hand rose in a gesture that silenced any attempt. He then extended his hand to the young woman. "The head table is incomplete without you." The phrase sounded like a sentence, echoing in every ear, awaiting a cruel spectacle. For a second, the world stopped. The group of heirs widened their eyes in disbelief. Some laughed. Nervously, others filmed, certain it was a staged act to further her downfall. But there was no sarcasm in his voice. He led her through the room, step by step, while every eye turned, first in shock, then in discomfort. With each table they passed, the whispers grew louder, mixing disbelief with indignation. Sitting at the center of power, flanked by the man everyone respected and feared, was like tearing apart the invisible rules that sustained that universe. Upon reaching the head table, he pulled out the velvet chair and invited her to sit. The gesture, seemingly simple, carried the weight of a silent revolution. She, her hands still trembling, accepted. Her eyes reflected the confusion of someone unsure whether she was being saved or exposed to an even greater trap. And deep down, behind the tension, there was a restrained strength, as if her entire life had prepared her to face exactly this kind of moment. Glasses clinked in falsely cheerful toasts, but all eyes were fixed on the unfolding scene. Sitting next to the most powerful man in the room was an insult to the invisible rules of that circle. The discomfort began with murmurs, then spread to muffled laughter. One of the women at the neighboring table whispered loudly enough to be heard, "Looks like they opened the wrong doors today." Another guest, laughing, commented, "Does she even know how to use the cutlery?" Cell phones were discreetly raised, capturing photos and videos that would be shared in closed groups as trophies of collective humiliation. The maitre d', still red with shame, remained motionless, torn between obeying the millionaire and fulfilling his role as guardian of exclusivity. With every second, the contempt became more explicit. A bottle of champagne was opened with exaggerated force. The cork popped, and the liquid sloshed slightly, eliciting laughter aimed in her direction, as if the invisible stain of poverty could be a source of amusement, even in trivial gestures. Even seated at the head table, the weight of exclusion remained on her shoulders. The waiter hesitated before pouring her glass, as if the gesture were an offense to the polished crystal. She stood erect, eyes fixed straight ahead, neither bowing nor reacting to the provocations. The millionaire beside her remained silent, observing every detail as if measuring not only her courage, but also the cruelty of the others. The once festive room had transformed into an arena of sharp glances, and every smile was a silent blow. But there was something in the air, a tension that foretold that this humiliation would not end the way everyone expected. The room seemed to breathe in unison, awaiting her reaction, as if everyone were certain she would shrink before their gazes. But contrary to expectations, she calmly placed her hand on the velvet table and let her eyes sweep over every face that stared at her with disdain. The silence took on an uncomfortable tone when, in a firm, unwavering voice, she said, "I knew exactly what would happen when I walked through those doors." Some laughed, trying to stifle the tension, but she didn't stop. "I knew the maitre d' would stop me, that you would laugh, that cell phones would rise like invisible weapons, and yet I walked in." The discomfort grew. The hesitant laughter gave way to confused looks. There was something in her serenity that dismantled the intentions of those who wanted her merely for show. She raised her still empty glass and placed it in the center of the table, like a silent challenge to the waiter who hesitated to serve her. "I'm not here by chance. I'm here because this kind of night reveals more about you than it does about me." Some people's breath quickened, and even the heirs who had initiated the bet shifted in their seats, as if the luxurious chair had suddenly burned under the weight of shame. The millionaire beside her didn't react, but his eyes shone for a moment, as if he'd just stumbled upon a fascinating enigma. She, even alone against an entire room, turned humiliation into a stage, turning the tables without shouting, only with the calm conviction of someone who had faced far worse things than looks of contempt. And it was in that instant that something invisible began to change. The millionaire spent the rest of the evening in apparent silence, but inside, her every word reverberated, like an echo, impossible to ignore. He wasn't used to being surprised, much less by someone who, according to the collective gaze of the room, shouldn't even be there. Yet there was something about her firmness, something about the way she returned his contemptuous glances without lowering her head, that stirred a sense of unease in him. After the celebration, when most of the guests had already left amid nervous laughter and venomous whispers, he remained, watching her leave the restaurant, with the same posture she'd used when she'd entered. Firm steps, without looking back. It was then that his curiosity turned to necessity. In the days that followed, he couldn't get her image out of his mind. He discreetly ordered an investigation to find the woman, certain he'd discover only a name lost amidst the city's statistics. But what he found shattered all his certainties. She worked in a small neighborhood bookstore, scraping by on a meager scrap, but the detail that struck him was something else. Years ago, the charitable foundation he patronized had received a handwritten thank you letter. In that letter, a young orphan, a survivor of a childhood marked by pain, thanked him for the scholarship that, for a brief time, had allowed her to dream of attending university. That handwriting was hers. The young woman who had faced Manhattan's elite that night without flinching was the same woman who had once been invisible even to statistics, but who carried within her the mark of someone who wouldn't bow. He remembered the letter, even the simple yet grateful phrases, "You don't know me, but this gesture made me believe there's still room for me in this world." The shock was accompanied by a sense of shame that didn't easily manifest in a man like him. The woman everyone laughed at and humiliated in the restaurant had a past tied to the very charity empire he liked to display like a public medal. And, cruelly, he realized he'd never bothered to look for the faces behind the numbers he printed on reports. Now, one of those faces stared back at him, alive, present, impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, her absence became an uncomfortable presence in his mind. The man accustomed to having everything at his fingertips, business, travel, women who orbited around him as if he were an unshakable sun, discovered he had no control over the one thing he truly wanted at that moment, to find her again. He passed the neighborhood bookstore where his investigators had indicated she worked, but it was closed. The lights were off, the window dusty, as if it had been hastily abandoned. He tried to track down information, but it seemed she had evaporated from the city, leaving only a trail of silence. And that silence hurt. He began to mentally revisit every detail of that night in the restaurant. Every word she had said, every gesture of courage disguised as calm. The gleam in her eyes when she claimed she knew everything now became an uncomfortable mirror. He, with all his power and money, felt empty in the absence of someone who possessed nothing. At subsequent social gatherings, as he tried to follow his usual routine, he noticed that the laughter of the other heirs and magnates now sounded hollow. The parties all seemed the same, the toasts tasted bittersweet, and even the million-dollar contracts lost their weight. For the first time, he noticed the loneliness within his own abundance. In moments of silence, he felt haunted by the memory of her eyes, and his former pride turned to unease. He began to dream of the scene over, and over, her entering the room, the maitre d' blocking her path, and the whole world laughing until her firm voice cut through the air. With each memory, he realized it wasn't just attraction, but the nagging feeling that she carried a truth he had lost. Time passed, and the more she disappeared, the more he found himself trapped by the absence. The entire city seemed too big, yet suffocating, because within it lay the absence of a single person. And then, just as he was getting used to the idea that he might never see her again, rumors began to surface. Small whispered rumors coming from unexpected circles that someone had posted videos of that night on social media, and that the public's reactions weren't favoring either him or those who laughed. The rumors began small, almost invisible, like sparks that spread silently before igniting an entire forest. The video of that night, recorded by hands eager for humiliation, escaped the closed groups and spread across social media. Within days, millions had watched the scene of the young woman barred from the door, the muffled laughter in the dining room, the cruel comments, and then the unexpected gesture of the millionaire who led her to the main table. But, contrary to what those present expected, the repercussion wasn't an entertainment spectacle. It was a public trial. The internet doesn't forget, much less forgive, cruelty disguised as luxury. Anonymous profiles began tagging the restaurant, denouncing the explicit discrimination. Influencers recorded videos commenting on the episode, pointing out how the elite still enjoy humiliating the weakest. Headlines appeared: Manhattan restaurant accused of elitism and prejudice. With each new post, his name also appeared, not as a savior of the scene, but as part of it. After all, for many, his attitude seemed calculated, a performance to clean up his image in the face of a shameful situation. Doubt gnawed at the narrative. Had he truly tried to defend her, or simply taken advantage of the moment to gain prominence? His partners began to question whether the repercussions could affect business. Invitations to social events were discreetly cancelled. The image of the untouchable man began to crack. In meetings, he noticed sidelong glances, whispers cut short by his arrival. In the press, his silence was interpreted as arrogance, and for the first time, the weight of judgment came not from those who envied him, but from the anonymous masses who pointed to him as a symbol of a rotten system. He who had always prided himself on being admired and feared was now seen as an accomplice to public cruelty. His downfall came not in the form of bankruptcy, but from something far more corrosive: the loss of the quiet respect that sustained his empire. And amidst all this turmoil, her absence became even more unbearable. It was as if only her presence could restore meaning to the chaos. He always believed that strength came from control. Controlling numbers, controlling people, even controlling his own feelings. But after the scandal, he realized he had no control at all. The days that were once filled with appointments, meetings, and business dinners became long and heavy. The silence of the hallways of his penthouse apartment, once a symbol of peace and luxury, now felt like a deafening void. For the first time, he began to look at himself without the filters of power. He spent hours in front of the mirror, not adjusting his tie, but trying to find in his reflection the man he believed himself to be. And the more he searched, the more he saw only the mask, the millionaire who knew how to negotiate contracts, but who had never allowed himself to experience a life outside the gilded bubble that surrounded him. The public criticism wasn't what hurt him most. What truly tore him apart were her memories, the way she stared at the entire room without lowering her eyes, her courage to say she already knew everything. The truth she carried in her gaze, so distinct from everyone around her. He began revisiting simple places, like neighborhood coffee shops and public libraries, seeking to understand the world beyond the glass walls he'd always lived within. He discovered that there were stories of struggle at every table, occupied by someone anonymous, stories that would never make it into the society columns he usually frequented. Slowly, his mannerisms began to change. He fired employees who treated him with automatic flattery, replacing them with people who spoke honestly. He cancelled social engagements just to walk the streets, observing the movements of ordinary people. He felt, for the first time, the strange mixture of vulnerability and freedom that came with anonymity. He realized that loneliness lay not in the absence of company, but in the lack of authenticity. At night, he reread reports from his own charitable foundation. He had never given it more than a cursory glance, but now each number haunted him. How many lives lay behind those graphs? How many stories like hers had gone unnoticed? He began writing notes by hand, as if trying to get closer to something more real, more human. He no longer saw himself as a man who needed to shine in public, but as someone who needed to learn to feel in silence. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was slow, painful, marked by falls in pride and sleepless nights. But little by little, the man who had once been a symbol of distance became someone capable of seeing that true value lay not in what one possessed, but in what one allowed oneself to feel. And in this process, an urgent desire grew within him to find again the one person who, without needing anything other than his own dignity, had shown him what it meant to be true. Their reunion didn't come with pomp or the spotlight of a gala dinner, but with the unexpected simplicity of a rainy afternoon in New York. He was walking aimlessly, protected by a black umbrella, lost in his own thoughts, when he spotted a small community market set up beneath makeshift tents. Used books were arranged on wooden tables, wet at the edges by the rain that insisted on penetrating the worn fabrics. He approached without knowing why, as if something invisible was drawing him, and then he saw her. She was there, rearranging stacks of books, talking to a child who, dazzled, held a colorful copy. She wore simple clothes, but there was a calm about her that contrasted with the chaos of the city. Her smile, though discreet, carried the same firmness he'd seen that night in the restaurant. For a moment his heart raced like it hadn't in years. It wasn't the imposing millionaire approaching, but a man pierced by longing and the need to be real. She noticed him before he even said a word. Their eyes met again, but this time there was no audience, no luxury, no mocking voices, just them, amid the sound of the rain. The silence that fell was heavy, but not of contempt. It was of unspoken memories, of questions lingering in the air. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. Then, as if asking permission, he simply approached and picked up one of the books from the table. "You were always here, even when you seemed to have disappeared," he said, and his words sounded more like a confession than a rehearsed phrase. She took a deep breath, smoothing her hair, wet from the rain escaping from the tent. She didn't answer immediately. She simply observed him with the serenity of someone no longer in a hurry to prove anything to anyone. He continued, "Since that night, nothing has been the same. I discovered who you are, or rather, I began to discover. And I realized that before you, I never truly was." The sincerity in his voice surprised him. It wasn't often that he let his armor slip. She looked away for a moment, watching the child run out of the tent with the book in his hands, laughing despite the rain. When she looked back at him, there was a mixture of compassion and distance in her eyes. "It's not about who I am," she said finally. "It's about who you choose to be now." Their reunion didn't bring easy answers, nor the catharsis he'd secretly hoped for. But it brought something more powerful, the chance to look at her, not as an object of desire or a painful memory, but as a mirror of what he could become. And for the first time, he didn't try to control the moment. He simply stood there, in the rain, before her, knowing the final decision was no longer in his hands. The rain dripped down the edges of the tent, and the silence between them seemed louder than the noise of the city. He waited, as if each second were a sentence, until she finally took a deep breath. "You came looking for me, didn't you?" she said calmly, but not softly. He nodded, unable to hide the anxiety that coursed through him. She lowered her eyes for a moment, as if searching within herself for the answer he'd been waiting for. "That night, everyone thought I was the victim, but in truth I already knew what I would find. I went in there not to be accepted, but to expose how much this world still delights in humiliation. You saw it, you felt it, and now you're here because you can no longer escape what you discovered about yourself." Her words weren't an accusation, they were an acknowledgement. He tried to justify himself, to talk about his change, the sleepless nights, the steps he'd taken toward a more authentic life. But she raised her hand, interrupting. "Transformation is only real when it doesn't depend on the approval of others. What you want isn't me. It's validation that you've changed. But I'm not a prize, nor redemption." There was a pause. His heart pounded as if each of her answers were a verdict. Then she moved closer, so close that he could smell the faint scent of damp paper wafting from the surrounding books. "I can forgive you, not for what happened that night, but because I carry something within me that you never understood. Life didn't teach me to hold a grudge, it taught me to resist." Her eyes met his, and there was an almost cruel firmness in them. "But forgiving doesn't mean staying." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the words had penetrated the last wall of pride. When he opened them, she was already gathering up her books, storing them in rain-soaked boxes. The gesture was simple, but it carried the symbolic power of someone choosing to move on. He wanted to ask her to stay. He wanted to promise a new world, but he knew none of that would matter. The decision was hers, and it had already been made. And then, without tears, without a dramatic goodbye, just with the calm of someone who masters their own destiny, she walked away into the rain. He remained still, motionless, feeling that the greatest lesson of his life came not from luxury, but from the silence of a goodbye without return. The rain had stopped when he finally left the community fair. The New York sky was covered in heavy clouds, and the streetlights reflected in the puddles scattered across the asphalt. He walked slowly, without an umbrella, allowing the remaining drops dripping from the rooftops to wet him as if it were a belated baptism. There was no longer an audience, no judgmental glances, just the distant sound of cars and the early morning chill. He stopped in front of a lit-up window. It was a closed antiques shop, but in the center of the glass was an object that caught his eye. A simple wooden chair, scarred by time, displayed as if it were art. He stood there motionless, staring at the chair that seemed to carry a quiet dignity, very different from the velvet thrones he had always sat on. Suddenly, he understood. It wasn't luxury that gave things value, but the history each one carried. In the distance, a woman crossed the street, holding a colorful umbrella. For a moment, the silhouette resembled hers, but soon dissolved into the nighttime crowd. He smiled, a sad, serene smile, accepting the absence as part of what he now needed to learn. He continued walking until he disappeared into the wet streets, just another anonymous man in the city that never sleeps. And in the market tent, forgotten on the table of soaked books, lay a single crystal goblet, left by her as if it were a silent message. There was no note, no explanation. Only the reflection of the rain accumulated inside the goblet, glinting in the dim streetlight, a reminder that some stories don't end with answers but with symbols. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below. I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.